Doing? Everybody doing okay? Hanging in there? Wondered if we could talk for a second about this remote learning and these various media that we use. And I wonder if you think any of this, what, if any of this is useful for the future? You know what I mean? Like when we are back on campus. What have you found useful about this that you would like to continue? And what should not be continued? Cameron.
I remember last year, teachers kind of just like brushed off Canvas and they were like, I don't want to learn it. But this year's kind of forced all the teachers to like really get to know it. And like
Yeah.
the way that Canvas is so like screwed, like it's so organized. I
Mm.
think that has been a big help for like keeping track of all the assignments. Like, so I would say keep like don't slack on the Canvas, even if we are in person.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm sorry, we're going back. I think I missed an email.
Well, at some point.
Oh,
You can
okay.
miss an email, don't worry. I'm just curious what aspects of this are of this remote learning experience are useful for the future to continue, perhaps. Anybody got any ideas?
Yeah, I think the recordings definitely help for referencing like stuff that I forget and I know you said, but I just can't remember.
Recording the classes. Sounds good. Anybody else? I'm not sure how I would record a traditional class because I kind of like run all over the classroom. I might have to put a mic on my lapel. But I noticed there in the past, when we were in person, there were students who would audio record the lectures, like with a little tape recorder. But I can see how that's valuable. Are any of you, are you guys accessing these recorded lectures? I've heard from some international students that they're useful because they're helpful because if we're discussing in English too quickly, they can reference these later.
Yeah, I'm American and I speak English and I still need to reference it for the same reason.
Yeah. I didn't mean to suggest it wasn't useful for everybody. Anybody else? Any other comments? Anything you're really looking forward to getting rid of or stop being done with? Are you guys enjoying remote learning?
I somewhat am, like in certain regards, but it just gets so exhausting sitting in front of a screen for hours. Like it's really draining, but as a whole, I feel like the classes are being handled pretty well.
Audra says the workload is way too much. Are you guys finding the workload is more now that we're online?
There's also somebody in one of my classes said like when you learn on campus, there's like a separation of like work and home. And like when you go from like working and then you get to go home, you get to kind of like take this breath and like be relaxed when you go home.
Yeah.
But work is home. So it's kind of just this whole energy of like there's no separations, there's not really any relief.
I know. That's a great point. Lan points out she's sleepy. I think this is hard for international students, huh? What time is it where you are, guys? Lan, what time is it where you are?
It's 1:13 in the morning, like 1:13 a.m.
Geez, that's when art students just wake up. What's the problem here? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, like, I have another class like yesterday at 5 a.m. in the morning, something like that. So,
Well, I was thinking that if I teach in the spring, if we are online, I might try and schedule my class at a time that's, easier for international students. Something like, 'cause I think if I taught like 7 to 9 p.m., that would be 7 a.m. your time, right? Or maybe 9 a.m. is 9 p.m. your time. I think Asia is just about 12-hour difference.
Sir,
Hey, Otto.
did you take the attendance? Because I was late a little bit.
Anna says the workload seems more repetitive. And Audra says she's having a hard time waking up at noon. That is an interesting point Lydia raises about work and home life bleeding together because we're all at home now, I roll out of bed and get right in front of my desk, There's things that are nice about that. I don't have to comb my hair, or get properly dressed. Or even brush my teeth sometimes. Just grab a cup of coffee, sit down and go. On the other hand, all the formalities are gone, right? Making a lunch, getting a jacket, blah, blah. I have a lot of time, but, well, not a lot, but I have more time, but it's curious. Cameron.
I was gonna say I started the semester with like a plan to kind of get around that, where like I would not let myself have any food at my desk, and I would not let myself eat in my room, and I'd make myself like get up in the morning and take a shower and get dressed like I was leaving the house. And then around like 2 weeks ago, that all went to shit, and I have dishes all over my desk, and I have not done any of that. So now it's just the plan did not work. I'm eating nuggets at my desk for breakfast at 1:16 p.m.
I hear you. Well, yeah, I don't know when we'll be back on campus, to be honest with you. Yes, self-care is important. This semester has unique stresses, right? And I would recommend you try to exercise. That's good for your mental wherewithal. Get out in the air once in a while instead of being cooped up in front of a screen. Being in front of a screen is uniquely fatiguing in itself. I was in front of a screen for like 8 hours last week with meetings in class, and I was so tired afterwards, and my daughter's getting headaches. So you really have to be careful. You have to give yourself some time. Lydia is going here saying it's a nasty cycle. You also have to be lax with self-care, right? You got to be good to yourself. Got to be good to yourself. Eat well and exercise. But, there are unique challenges this semester and unique stresses. So I want you to be in touch with me if any are getting in the way of your, of your progress in class. So let me know what I can do to help, okay? Because like you, I am also trapped at home and aware what's going on. So love to help out, okay? Any other last comments about or observations about this online learning experience? No? Okay. Good. So, right. Let's talk about the Republic. Last week we were discussing book 3 for the most part, talking about his critique of art, Plato's critique of art, his critique of the poets, his critique of visual arts, which led us to a very interesting discussion of propaganda. And then book 3 culminates in the myth of the metals, which is one of two major myths that Plato incorporates into the Republic. So it's worth considering this myth as an example, I guess, of the appropriate kind of art. And he is rather specific about, the intentions of this, the political intentions of this, the political purpose. I see Audra has a comment about attending Zoom at all different times of day. Yes, it is draining. I agree. Good, which is why we'll be, I think an hour and a half is appropriate for us. So let's move on. The myth of the metals, and he's very, I wrote one of the essay prompts about this for you all for your next essays to consider, some of his comments leading up to that myth, their comments leading up to this myth. They discuss things like, the purpose of the myth, of course, but also why the myth is needed, what specifically is necessary for. And their major concern seems to be that people in the city are not going to accept or believe, or they might be negligent about their nature and the specific jobs or tasks that it points them to, right? Basically, the myth of the metals is meant to underpin the essentialism, Plato's essentialism, which, as I said earlier, it was a very common notion in the ancient Mediterranean at this time. And it is a very important notion that endures in the West through the Middle Ages until the age of democracy, basically. In the Middle Ages, they had this idea of the chain of being. And what the chain of being meant was that every person at different stations in society, that was your destiny, to be in that place in society. A little bit different from Plato. In the medieval Christian view, it was more an issue of fate or destiny. For Plato, we see that it is a matter of natural talents that determine where you should be. Some of you in your comments, I've noticed a few of you have pointed out a link or how this is reminiscent to the caste system in India. And actually it is rather similar. For anybody here who's read the Bhagavad Gita, which is the I guess the most read section of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita is a very important document explaining some of the religious theories, or the social and religious theories of Hinduism. And there is a similar notion in the Bhagavad Gita about the fact that your nature determines where you are in society, and it's not at all meant to be unfair or unjust or dismissive. Your nature is taken at face value as something that determines what you should do, what you should be, and there's nothing unfair about it, right? This is how early thinking about the caste system was explained, and it's very similar to how Plato was thinking of things. Of course, in the West, this has come under significant critique and succumbed to the modern notion of liberty, where you are not bound or determined by your nature at all. Good. But let's wade into book 4 book 4 of the Republic, which is where we get the definition of justice. We also get Plato's psychology, his theory of the soul. So book 4 is pretty dang important. Book 5 I had you read today. Book 5 is a hoot, talking about the various recommendations for the lives of the guardians. I mean, there's a lot there. We have to get to the bottom of that shit. But I still am in shock. 20 years later, I'm still shocked by book 5, that that's in one of the greatest books of Western civilization. But anyway, Book 4. So the task of the I'm going to move past the opening discussion of book 4, which I think is very important, but many of you commented on your response for last week, so I'm not going to belabor it, where he basically argues that the guys are discussing recommendations for some kind of seemingly silly things, like that the guardians, when they're children, the games they play must be lawful. They must listen to music that is similarly lawful. And the general point, which I think is actually a really, really important political point, is that rule of law and the orderliness of a society is something that is enacted from the ground up. It is something enacted through culture. And they even say at one point that you cannot make a society lawful or law-abiding from the top down, which means to say you can't make it lawful or law-abiding just by imposing laws on it. If society is already coming apart at the seams, mere law is not going to do it. It can actually make things worse. And I guess the point, this kind of underscores their project of utopia here. The surest way, it would seem, in one respect, I guess, to create a society that is lawful and orderly is to ensure that it is culturally lawful from the beginning, that the right kind of stories are told, that the kids play the right kind of games, that people are doing what they should be doing in society, right? And then they even say at one point, when you have created a society that is inherently lawful and orderly like this, the laws are actually irrelevant or redundant, because they're not necessary. This is line 427 AB. So again, I think that's a really neat topic. And if anybody wants to write about it further, I'd be happy to discuss it with you. But I want to get into the meat of book 4, which is the issue of justice, okay? So if you recall, there were 2 major tasks that, there's a couple major tasks. There's 3 in particular. Let me say that. There's 3 in particular. There's 3 tasks that the men have charged Socrates with doing. They've said to him, right? We want you to define justice. And then they say in book 2, we also want you to prove that justice is worthwhile in itself. That being just is worthwhile or beneficial for the soul and not just for its rewards. Justice is a good for itself. In other words, justice pays. Define what justice is and prove that justice pays. That justice benefits you personally, excuse me. So he is going to define justice in book 4. In order to prove the second part, he needs to define what justice in the soul is. And then for next week, when you read book 9, you'll see his answer to the second question is where he proves how justice is beneficial for the soul, how justice pays and injustice does not. Okay? So let's dive into this. So again, their task in the reason they are building a city, an ideal city, they say, is because they want to see justice writ large. They want to see it big. They want to see it in a fast format that's easy to pick out and spy and detect. And at this point, they built out the city. We have 3 classes. We have the artisan class, we have the guardian class, and the ruling class, which we're going to talk about today. The ruling class, they've been touched on briefly. It was established that they exist. They come out of the guardians. But we're going to get more details about them today and at the end of book 5, and especially next week in book 7. Or this week in book 7 if we get to it. We have 3 classes. The city is built out. And so around 427D, the men say, okay, now let's see where justice is. Okay? Well, if this ideal city is built out, Plato says, or Socrates says, then all the virtues should be visible. All virtues should be visible, And there are 4 virtues in particular. What are these 4 virtues? And there is a reasoning to these virtues. They map onto the classes of the city. Anybody know what these 4 virtues are in book 4 that the men isolate? There we go, Sonny. Wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. Yeah, and these come up around 428 to 430. And as I mentioned, these map on to the classes of the city. Which class should display wisdom? Ruling class. That's right. Which class should display courage? Guardians. Thank you, Robert. What's moderation? What is moderation? Can anybody define this as a virtue? Michael says drinking half a bottle of wine, not a whole one. Okay. Temperance, Audra says. Yeah, often moderation and temperance are kind of synonymous. Which class of the city displays moderation?
Would
Or-
it be all?
I'm sorry?
I'm not finding it, but would it be all?
No.
Is it the Guardians because they like couldn't have money or anything?
No. But you and Lauren raise a good point. I guess they definitely have moderation for sure. One way of putting it, I guess, is what virtue is most important for the various classes? The ruling class must be wise. Does that mean they can't be courageous? No, they can be courageous too, but they must be wise. The guardians must be courageous, more than most. The artisans, more than most, they must display moderation. They must display temperance. Why is that important? This is 430E that he makes this correlation. I'm not going to dwell on this point, but why does he make this correlation? It's not particularly, 430E, moderation is surely a kind of order, the mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires, self-control. And they say down around 431E, now one finds all kinds, sorry, this is 431C, I'm wrong, 431C. One finds all kinds of diverse pleasures, desires, pleasures, and pains, mostly in children, women, household slaves, and those of the inferior majority who are called free. So he's worried about the desires of the inferior majority, the artisan class. And so moderation is a prime virtue for them because their desires are pronounced. Any questions? Plato's an elitist, everybody. Okay? He's an elitist. But that was par for the course this time of history. It was not taken for granted that everyone had equal talents or abilities, intellectual or physical. And the presumption is that those with special intellectual talents, they rise to the top as rulers. And those in the audience in class, they don't have those intellectual talents. They have to worry about their desires. We have to worry about the desires of this class. This leaves one this leaves one virtue left. That's justice. We see the four virtues. We see wisdom in the ruling class, courage in the guardians, moderation in the artisan class. Where's justice? Where is justice, or what is justice, according to Plato, in this city? What's justice?
Plato talked about it as like when people stay in their class or like their rank or whatever, and there's no mixing or attempts to mix. That's like the ultimate justice to your city.
Yep, you got it. People doing what they're supposed to do. The salient quote is line 433a. Justice, I think, is exactly what we said must be established throughout the city. When we were founding it, either that or some form of it, we stated and often repeated, if you remember, that everyone must practice one of the occupations in the city for which he is naturally best suited. Yes, we said that. Moreover, we have heard many people say, and I often said ourselves, that justice is doing one's work, one's own work, and not meddling with what isn't one's own. Then in turn, it turns out that this doing one's own work, provided that it comes to be in a certain way, is justice. Okay. Do not meddle in work that is not your own. That is injustice. Justice is doing what you're supposed to be doing, and for the classes to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay? Now, on one hand, this might seem really strange, but and on one hand, it may sound alien to how we understand justice. But on the other hand, it may not. It may be just a different way of wording something that makes sense to us. And I think hopefully it might make more sense when we start to fill out the picture. There's more to it than just this, okay? But the initial definition of justice is everybody doing what they're supposed to be doing, okay? Which also means do what you're best at. Because if you're not, and you're a born baker, as Audra puts it in there in the chat, and you insist on being a dancer, that you're committing injustice. And you're a shitty dancer, I'm presuming. You're doing an injustice to the city. If you're a baker, you're too busy to go rob a bank, I guess. Well, maybe it's not even about busy, Audra. Do you have the talents for it? But I don't want to get too hung up on robbing banks, because I'm not sure that fits in any of the official jobs. If you're a good robber, I guess go join the Guardians. They might need you. They could use your talents. Anybody have any questions or comments?
I think this for me is when I started to reference the caste system in my reading responses, as this feels like I understand, I think, kind of where he's coming from, but I think sometimes it felt a little bit extreme for me, the fact that there's no intermingling of classes, not intermingling, but there's no class transcendence. And I know that's an American thing, you know, that's the American dream. It's the way I internalized it as a kid. But it's I don't know. I can't really picture his world where like the artisan class is really treated with the respect that it deserves. I feel like they will just be left behind. Well, like the rulers, I don't know. I can't see it going well. Them like just staying as artisans for their whole life.
Good. And you know, and I think Socrates shares your concern, or Plato does actually, because if you pay attention, you notice there's several points throughout where the men say things like, "And do you think people will accept their lot? Do you think people will accept their position?" Right? That's one of the reasons they are motivated to write that myth. If he presumed people would accept this, why would he worry about it? Right? He's worried. Lauren.
I think like another thing that kept on coming back to me when reading sort of the more extreme parts of like not intermingling and all that is that a lot of like any sort of interdisciplinary work is just dead. Like you don't like so much of like the art world, the scientific community, just everywhere, like collaboration with other disciplines can often lead to good things. That doesn't necessarily mean that like Baker is suddenly going to like do nuclear physics and immediately get it. Like you need to retrain at that point. But like it was so extreme that it kind of discounted any instance where it would be valuable for people to work together and kind of polarized people.
Awesome. I love that point. That's a great point. It's taken for granted in much of American academia, for example, that kind of, what's the word, like pollination is key between the different, sometimes very different fields, right? Very different specialties and majors. And is he precluding that? Good. Anybody else? Okay, well, let's move on to talk about his psychology. And why are we going to talk about psychology? Well, psyche in Greek means soul. So technically, psychology for Plato really just means his theory of the soul. So I will use those words. I will use those words interchangeably. I explained to you earlier, and first of all, why are we talking about the soul? Because don't forget, that was really the charge of the guys at the beginning. They said, we want you to define justice, and we want you to prove that it is worthwhile for the individual who practices it. That is, in other words, it is beneficial for the soul. Well, if he's going to define that, if he's going to address the second part, he needs to define what justice in the soul looks like. So he's moving from a definition of justice in the city to a definition of justice in the soul. He has to do this. But in order to do this, he must also define the soul. Now, psychology, first of all, one thing I want you to understand is that for the ancient Greeks, a theory of the soul was crucially important for philosophy, because philosophy largely had a therapeutic aspect to it, which is to say that all philosophers busied themselves with prescribing paths to happiness, some more practically than others. I hope you will have noticed so far that Socrates is very concerned for happiness. His path is a little bit more cryptic or difficult, but many of his followers, like Epicurus and Seneca and Cicero, they have very specific handbooks for happiness, right? And it's all premised on a theory of the soul. You can't point the way to happiness if you don't explain what you think the soul looks like. And therefore, you can't explain how to manage the soul. Now, the other point I wanted to make about the soul, about ancient Greek psychology, is this. Their notion of the soul is pretty expansive. When you hear soul, when 21st century Americans hear the word soul, they may tend to think of something in the Judeo-Christian tradition, something that's religiously infused. That is not necessarily the case as Plato is going to explain it. Technically speaking, the soul is the principle of movement, or I should say self-movement. I just defined that and put it in there. What does that mean? That means that anything that moves itself has a soul. And that means that encompasses all living things. A stone does not have a soul. A cat has a soul. A tree has a soul. Water does not have a soul. You have a soul because you are self-moving. A tree is self-moving, it changes. There's a kind of motion in it that is self-directed, very slow. Most trees don't walk, by the way. No trees walk. I'm just messing with you. But they do change slowly. And so humans have a soul, but our soul is going to be different from other animals. That's the point. So let's wade into his theory of the soul here. I think some of you wrote about this as well. The soul, by the way, for Plato, we call this the tripartite soul. Why? Because it has three parts. So what are these three parts of the soul? Who knows? Somebody give me the first part.
The rational part of the soul.
You got the rational part. Then what? Oh, Lauren.
The part that's in charge of appetites. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but
The appetitive part. I know that sounds weird. We don't speak it. Sometimes I like to just call it the desirous part of the soul. Appetite and desire, he means by them really the same thing. What kind of desires? Hello, hello.
Like earthly desires of the flesh of the earth, of the drinking and, just pleasure.
Good. Bodily desires. Thanks, Mike. I just want to be clear. Sexual desires. Good. What's the third part? So I'm just in case I'm not clear, we have reason, we have appetite or desire, and then we have third one. What's the third part of the soul?
It's called the spirited part, but I'm still not sure what that means.
Good. You are absolutely right, Sonny.
Part or whatever.
Anybody want to explain it? They have an idea what it is? Anybody know how it comes up?
Are we talking about the spirit part?
Yes.
I remember in the book they were explaining that sometimes when someone gets really angry at themselves for going for the desires.
Good. Do you remember what story in particular he tells? It's a great little story, although kind of gory.
No, I need to check my book quickly.
Remember? He does.
No.
He gets angry with himself. I'll wait a second and see if anybody remembers. Well, they start out by saying there's obviously two parts. There's reason and appetite. They find these uncontroversial. And actually, that was a very common view among the Greeks. Aristotle has the very same distinction of the soul, rational, irrational. But then the guys are talking with Plato and they say, but isn't there some like other part of the soul that's like kind of in between? And they land at the spirited part. But they tell one of the men, I think it's Socrates, actually tells a story to illustrate why he thinks a third part exists. Does anybody remember that story? He goes outside the city gates one day and he sees something. Lauren?
It's a guy who sort of is captivated by all these corpses, and he wants to look, but he realizes he shouldn't look, and then he kind of looks anyway.
Right, and he says, "Take your fill, you dirty eyes." Right? Funny story. Well, also gross. By the way, in ancient Greece, they would have thrown dead bodies outside the city walls more commonly if people were executed and they were, they committed some kind of crime or offense. They weren't allowed to be buried properly. They would be killed, and then their body would be left for the wild animals to eat it. So not cool. So some guy walks out, sees a body. He is drawn by desire to take it in. What kind of desire? What's that desire called, everybody? Mike didn't mention this one. The desire to see blood and gore. That's a good old American desire. Anybody know what I'm talking about here? It's actually a universal human desire. Animalistic. I don't know, Vivian. I don't see animals like watching torturing and decapitations and stuff like this, you know it. Does that mean never mind? Thanks. Technically, it's called bloodlust. And actually, I'm glad you raised the issue, Vivian, animalistic, because I think it is kind of unique. Oh, here I am about to say how unique it is to humans, and Audra points out that cats play with their mice. That's true, they do. So humans and cats have bloodlust. Humans have this strange propensity to like to watch bloody movies or see executions. I mean, in the old days, before television, public executions was the prime entertainment experience in the city square. Yeah, sadism not exclusive to humans. Well, as Freud is going to notice, it is a special, especially prominent in humans though. But in any case, what does this tell us about the spirited part? By the way, that story that comes up around 439E. Well, the spirited part, I think Lauren mentioned anger. The spirited part, what is the spirited part? It is the seat of the emotions. So essentially what he did is he's defied, you could also understand the spirited part, although nobody ever calls it this, you could also refer to it as the emotional part of the soul. You could. But we typically tend to talk about the spirited part, the rational part, and the desires part. Now, there is a political mapping of the psychology, which means to say that these parts of the soul map onto parts of the city. And there is a bodily mapping of the soul, which means to say that these parts of the soul reside principally in certain parts of the body. Okay? Now, the Greek for the spirited part is called the thumetikon. I put it in the chat there. Thumos equals is your chest. Why did the Greeks think that the spirited part resides in your chest? Because when you're angry, ... What happens? Any idea why they mapped it onto the chest? What happens to your chest when you're gripped by certain emotions? Anger, courage, fear.
How am I gonna word this? Like either you breathe more heavier, your heart's like beating faster at a different pace than it normally would.
You put it perfectly, Henry. That's exactly it. They noticed that when soldiers march into battle, their heart beats more fiercely. So they said that's where courage resides. The desirous part of the body, the desirous part of the soul resides in the lower parts of the region of the soul, sorry. And reason resides in the brain, in the head. So there's a bodily mapping of these parts of the soul. Okay. Let's think about this tripartite soul for a second. So the human soul has a rational part, a spirited part, and an irrational part. Sorry, desirous part. What does this suggest about the human psyche? The fact that it has three parts. What does that say to you? What does that imply? Anybody have any thoughts?
It does suggest that these three parts must also work with each other, but also somewhat fight against each other.
Good. Nice. And Robert says in the chat, the inherent complexity of humans. Very nice. I'd love to hear more about that, Robert. Lauren?
I think it also, like, it sort of gives almost a bit of hope for more perfect human action, because like it gives reason for negative human action, and it gives a sort of pure part of humans that's good.
What do you mean it gives reason for imperfect human action? What do you mean there?
Well, if like your sort of more base desires are one part of you, your spirit and courage is another, and your reason is another, like you have the potential for a number of different actions, and none of them is particularly inevitable.
Nice. I get it. There are different sources of inspiration of our behavior, organic sources. Good. Sid.
Yeah, I was like kind of thinking the same way as Lauren about like how it relates to actions, but like working backwards, I'm thinking that like you can't trace one event to one particular reason. That like instead it's more cumulative and like additive. Like there are multiple reasons as to why something could have occurred, and it's like you can't really pin it down on one.
Very nice. Robert talks about, like, agreeing with Sunny that, you know, this part suggests that there may be combat within ourselves. Exactly. And that's actually exactly the way that Plato is going to understand it. Anybody else? Do you guys still read Freud? Does anybody still read Freud?
I'm a fan of Freud.
Well, there is something proto-Freudian here. This idea, I mean, much of Freud's theory is controversial, but it was culturally very impactful because he points out that there are parts of the soul that escape or elude human reason. You know, there are parts of the soul. Well, he said parts of the psyche, and he was referring to the id. And essentially, Plato posits the same thing here. There are parts of the soul that are under your control and can be known, and there are parts of your soul that are not, that are almost alien, if you will. And just to illustrate an example that anticipates what Sunny and Robert were talking about, and we're going to see this example in the Phaedrus at the end of class. One of Plato's great analogies for the soul is he says that it's like a charioteer with two horses. And the charioteer is reason. And then one horse is rather well-behaved and the other is frothing at the bit and frenzied. And that's desire. And the one that is well-behaved is spirit, is the spirited part. What it means is that reason is a constant battle with these other two parts of the soul, but desire is especially oppositional. In fact, when you get to book 9 for next week, you'll see just how oppositional it can be. The spirited part can also be oppositional, but can also be made into an ally of reason that can then tame the irrational part. Yeah, as Robert points out, even Freud is going to have what looks to be like a tripartite psyche: the id, the ego, and the superego. They don't exist. The id does match onto the irrational part, but the ego and the superego is a little bit more complex. But I just wanted to point out to you here that this is something that actually, because the field of psychology doesn't properly, in the West, it is not properly created until the end of the 19th century. So there is a very long period in which this field was dormant. But this is a proto-Freudian notion. So here you have the soul. This is his definition of soul. What will you notice? Well, you'll notice that it maps onto the city. Right? Just as there are 3 parts of the soul, there are 3 parts of the city. And they start to look similar, right? Moderation is the virtue of the desirous part too. Courage is the virtue of the spirited part. Wisdom is the virtue of the rational part. You could also put it this way. The artisans, they are people who tend to be dominated by the desirous part of the soul. The guardians tend to be dominated by courage. They tend to be dominated by the spirited part, excuse me. And the rulers should be dominated by the rational part. What is justice in the soul? Audrey says balance. Can I hear some more specifics from anybody, or including Audra or anyone? Yep. There you go. Audra, no part is dominating the other or meddling in the other's affairs. Flip it around. Do what you are supposed to do. Each part, I should say, should do what it's supposed to do. And that means that they should not meddle or dominate one another. Audra says you get your desires under control. What that means is that desire should not dominate the soul, right? Desire has its part. Desire has its time. Friday night, you can go with Mike, open that bottle of wine, drink half. Better yet, drink 1 glass. The spirited part has its time. You're going into battle. Yeah, get pumped up. Get into a fight with your kid. Not so much. Tone it down, dial it down. Okay. This is line 443D. He defines it. One who is just does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another part or allow the various classes within him to meddle with each other. He regulates well what is really his own and rules himself. He puts himself in order, is his own friend, and harmonizes with the 3 parts of himself like 3 limiting notes in a musical scale, high, low, and middle. He binds together those parts and any others there may be in between, and from having been many things, he becomes entirely one, moderate and harmonious. So Audra is perfectly right to point out the idea of balance here. In fact, this is something I really haven't called your attention to so far, but from the beginning, this idea of harmony is very important. It comes up in a variety of places, especially, for example, when they're talking about the education of the guardians, they talk about the importance of music. And so we now see why harmony is so important, because you have different parts of the soul, balance must be preserved, right? There must be harmony between the parts of the soul. So music is an important part of the education for that reason. Okay. And they liken the unjust soul to a kind of civil war. That's in line 444B, right? Where the parts of the soul are at war with each other. So justice has been defined, and then they say in 445A, now it is time, or next, it is time to see if justice is more profitable, or sorry, to see if it is more profitable to act justly, right? That's the next task. That's the next task. They have defined justice. Next, they will want to see if it is more profitable to act justly. But that's not going to come until book 9. Questions? Questions or comments or complaints or anything at all?
When Socrates talks about the spirited part, is he saying that courage is only bravery for the moral things? That is, courage is always right, and if it's not, spirited and brave for the right things, then it isn't courage.
You're saying something that Aristotle was going to argue, actually, but Plato doesn't really take up that line of discussion. But I think it makes sense. When courage is misplaced, it's not really courage. That's the point. If I understand you correctly. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? This is a big chapter here, so please make sure if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. Sid?
Yeah, I feel like it's like kind of contradictory that they're like, on the one hand, they're acknowledging that like humans are composed of like these 3 different parts and they all like sort of affect each other. But at the same time, like with the city, if I'm understanding this correctly, like they want to divide certain areas to like be more inclined towards like certain parts. Like it kind of seems like their actions aren't fully reflecting how they feel about the soul.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry.
Like, I guess what I mean is, for the city, they want to have like certain classes more proficient in certain aspects of the soul, but that kind of goes against like the whole idea of the soul, like of balance, basically.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. So what do? You raised an excellent question, Sid. What do you do if you are dominated by the desirous part? Or you're dominated by the spirited part and your rational capacity is not terribly proficient? Any ideas? I think that's what you're asking, Sid, right?
Yeah, I feel like their response to that might be to like suppress one part and like try to heighten the other.
Well, basically, it's more like if your rational part of your soul is not proficient, the service provided by rational part can come from elsewhere. Anybody know what I mean? There's a surrogate, if you will. No? That's the class system itself. Don't forget, Plato is not interested in the individual alone. He said this several times, right? The individual happiness is dependent on the whole. So in other words, if the rational part of your soul is not terribly proficient, Sid, this is what the ruling class, this is the position this is the role that the ruling class must supply. And if your spirited part is not proficient, this is what the guardian class must supply. You understand what I'm saying, Sid? So
yeah, like kind of straying away from the individual aspect of it.
And so if you want justice in the soul is also highly dependent on things outside you. It's very independent on your environment. It's dependent on the city itself. Okay. And I'm glad you raised that, Sid. That's actually a really important point. The Greeks believed that there is no virtue and there's no happiness for an individual outside society. You must be part of a society. This is what provides that crucial training or discipline. Aristotle says that man outside society is either beast or God. Without society, humans devolve to the beastly nature, or if they survive, they're like a god, they're self-sufficient. But that's not a human trait, is his point, right? Humans need the support of society. And it's, in the individual well-being, the individual happiness is unthinkable without the well-being of society. Which means that if society is doomed, if society is chaotic or anarchic, your individual moral welfare is doomed. That's one of the reasons Socrates is so loath to upset the laws of Athens. Because if he does, he's really sinking the ship. And how do you recover from that? Better to have a ship that you can reform. Okay? Other questions or comments? All right. All right, good. Let's get into book 5. Book 5, exciting, spicy, slightly sexy, or not. Let's see. So book 5 is very funny the way it opens. You know, book 4 ends like, oh, we've defined justice in the soul, and then the men all high five. Like, we did it. Like, now let's talk about justice if it's beneficial. And Socrates is like, or I think Socrates says, now we're going to talk about how it's beneficial. And book 5 opens and they're like whispering to each other, like, and should we mention? And one of the men overheard them say, like, is it worth bringing up? And Socrates is like, whoa, what? And they're like, well, you mentioned women and children in common, and that's kind of a big deal, dude. And you're just going to like skate on past that? That's not cool. We need to have an entire chapter about this. And Socrates says, you're right. You caught me. We totally should. But before that, they open up here to discussing the status of women. And specifically, we're talking about the guardians. What do these guys have to say about the status of women, of female guardians? What is the debate? What is the debate about female guardians? It makes a lot of sense, actually, coming out of their discussion of essentialism. Lauren.
What is a woman's natural role? Like, is a woman's nature inherently different from men? And if so, what roles are they set for, or are they the same and therefore they have to fulfill the same roles?
Awesome. Anybody else?
A lot of what they said also was that, like, women are capable of fulfilling the same tasks, but in every regard, they see them as weaker.
All right, what your dog said too. That's perfect. Good. Why? I mean, essentially, there is a very pointed question here too, which is, Socrates, you mentioned there are going to be female guardians, right? And this is an issue because they are concerned, will women be fighting, right? Do you get the sense that that was a popular site back then? Women warriors? No, no. Anybody know there is one mythical group of Greek women warriors? Anybody know what they are?
Talking about the Amazons?
Amazons. That's right. I don't even know where that myth comes from. Historical basis. Maybe. Yeah, if you say so. I don't really know. The point is that it was very uncommon to see women on the battlefield. And so when Socrates raises it, they're like, that would be preposterous. And what would principally be preposterous about it is because of women, one of the aspects of women, it'd be preposterous that there were women soldiers, but also they have a general discussion about whether women are equal to men and do all the things they should do, including training. And they would do their training at the palestra. The palestra, that's a name. I'm not exactly sure how that translates. I think today we would call this the gym. But there was something special about how the ancient Greeks trained. Anybody know how the ancient Greeks trained? What that looked like?
Weren't they all naked?
They were naked.
And weren't they also like oiled up?
And oiled up. So I forget where this is, around 451 or 2. They're like, you mean to say we're going to go to the gym and women will also be oiled up and training? And what they're most upset about is, like, it's so bad. They're like, we're going to see old men and now we're going to see old women, right? Their naked bodies, and they're objecting to this. And Socrates, pushes back. All right, there you go. Socrates pushes back. And he insists there will be women soldiers. And they think this is just cray-cray. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. And I don't mean it in egalitarian. I mean, they're not wrong because there is something that it doesn't exactly follow his logic, right? What I mean to say is, at this point in the Republic, you could reasonably expect that he'd say that women should not be soldiers. But he says that they are. So why does he say that they are? Why does he say in his ideal city, we'll have women soldiers too? Anybody know? Oh, I think Samantha basically said it in so many words now that I think about it. Anybody want to add to it? Lauren?
So he kind of goes through this long explanation of how they've never really defined how they're going to decide whose nature is what. And he then argues that arguing that women have different natures simply because of being women is arguing that people have different natures because of like the way they look and or their physicality. So like he talks about bald men versus long-haired men. So just being women doesn't constitute a different nature completely.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the reason that this dispute makes sense for the guys, or why they're confused, the reason their confusion makes sense is this. He has held to this point throughout that your nature determines what you should do. And by nature, he tends to mean your physical nature and your emotional and intellectual nature combined. Like, what is your aptitude for? So he's kind of set himself up to say that women should not be soldiers, but then he pulls back on this contention, as Lauren points out, saying, well, actually, women, just as much as men, have the aptitude for being soldiers. They just may not be physically capable for the same things, but that does not preclude them or exclude them from being soldiers too. So he insists on equality of the sexes at this point. Around 457b, he and his men, they call this the first wave. The first wave. And what scholars, close to being woke, but still so broke, but scholars, yeah, I'll comment that in one second. But scholars understand this term, this notion of first wave. They call this the first wave of paradox. There are going to be 3 waves of paradox in book 5. And this is the first one. Women and men are equal. Now, close to being woke, yes. This would have been a controversial thing to say in ancient Greece, for sure. But he's still a sexist. That's just, let's be clear. I think that's all I have to say about that. Lauren?
I kind of felt like going through this book was kind of like constantly going between, oh, that's really controversial for the time, and oh my gosh, why are we here? How did we end up at eugenics? And it just kind of went back and forth between, oh, that's interesting, and holy crap. So
Yes, holy crap is right.
I also agree with that. Like, I think this was more in earlier books, but it's the ableism for me. Like, it's the clearly they didn't have much medical treatment other than natural remedies, and labeling women as being psychotic probably happened for having medical issues. But like, it's the if you're chronically ill, you are useless and should die for me. And I think that like the eugenics, it just, it's to be expected, but it's also we're, like Lauren said, we're literally come full circle with that.
Well, I think his position is much more nuanced, so be careful. But we'll dive into that. Cameron.
I was gonna say, when I was doing my reading response, I Googled the definition of eugenics to make sure I was on par with what I was saying. And then the first thing that came up was citing Plato as the author of the concept of eugenics. And I was like, holy fuck, man, that got way worse than I expected.
He didn't author it.
Not author, but he did not credited with the was he referenced in the widespread use of it?
From? Where did he get the idea from?
Where did Plato get the idea from?
Sparta.
But they didn't write, right?
I have to translate for you something that's in your text, and I am so bad with the spelling. I have to find it. Oh, there is an older word that is used to describe that is that. There's another word for Sparta. Lacedaemonia. Ugh. And it came up here, so I'm trying to find it. But I just want you to know that when you see the word Lacedaemonians, which is a big word, if anybody finds it, because I can't spell it, he is referring to the Spartans. This idea comes, I'm going to put that in the text. It's something like that, where if you see that word, that's Sparta. That was the word they used. I'm not actually sure where the word Sparta comes from. I wonder if it might be Latin. It might be from the Romans. Yeah, let's dive in here. So that's the first wave. Women are equal to men. Second wave. The second paradox, women and children in common. In other words, there will be no families. The guardians will be one big family. We'll discuss the logic of that in a bit. But this quickly moves into another discussion, which is about the breeding of children. And you guys notice immediately that eugenics is on the table. This is line 459E, 459E. And I want you to pay very close attention to the language in this book. He says, 459E. It follows from our previous arguments first that the best men must have sex with the best women as frequently as possible, while the opposite is true of the most inferior men and women. And second, that if our herd is to be of the highest possible quality, the former's offspring must be reared, but not the latter's. And this must all be brought about without being noticed by anyone except the rulers, so that our herd of guardians remains as free from dissension as possible. I want you to look really, really hard at that paragraph. That's a very upsetting paragraph, right? That's the way that's put is like outrageous. But there are two things he said in there that are really like should raise your eyebrows. I mean, among the many things in here, what catches your eyes? Izzy. That's so funny. What catches your eye in that paragraph, 459E? There's a couple words in there. Can anybody do this dispassionately as possible, analytically? The system is hidden. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah. How fucked up is that, right? This will be brought out without being noticed by anyone except the rulers. No one will know. That's, hang on. And what does he refer to? Look at the language he uses to refer to the guardians in that passage. There's one term that comes up twice. Herd. Depending on your translation, mine has herd. A herd. Who does this? What we're talking about? We're talking about eugenics here, right? Eugenics means, literally in Greek, means good genes. Oi in genes. What's the matter with me? Oi in Greek means good.
I have something to say about just relevancy, both from a like decolonialist perspective, but also today. Herd immunity to COVID is eugenicist to me. And like, I don't know, I know we're not really talking about current events, but I think when it comes to what like Plato's trying to say, I just want to acknowledge that it's just like eugenics is so deeply rooted in European colonialist, or not European, but white colonialist ideology. And like, I just think it's interesting that like a lot of the, like, I know this is kind of obvious, but I just think it's worth acknowledging that places like Egypt and other parts of Africa, and like at the time were seen as so primitive, as well as indigenous, more indigenous things, where because they didn't use eugenics and weren't incestuous. I don't know. I just think it's worth like acknowledging how that relates to today with herd immunity, and because you said the word herd is straight up just eugenics, and just treats people as disposable.
Well, let me say one thing, Vivian. I am only qualified to speak of Plato. I don't know.
No, yeah, I understand.
I don't know how widespread. If you want to understand if other cultures employed any form of eugenics, or what could be considered eugenics, you have to consult anthropologists. I don't honestly know the answer. All I can say is that Hitler looked to the Spartans. He said they were his inspiration. he doesn't quote Plato. He doesn't cite Plato. He cites the Spartans. And there's a very important reason he doesn't cite Plato, which I'm going to get at, but only after a bit, because we have to spin this out first. Okay. What I want you to notice here in 459E is this is how farmers operate. I have a cousin, he raises cattle. This is what he does. He looks for the biggest and the strongest, and he breeds them together. So why is he talking about a herd? Okay, think about that. That's curious. But we got to move into this now. Lauren raises a good point. First of all, this is supposed to happen incognito, which is weird in itself. But the big question is, how is this supposed to be incognito? So, all right, how is this going to not be noticed by the guardians? That the best are breeding with the best and the others are not.
Isn't it from a rigged lottery system?
A lottery. Call it what you will. I'm sure you all have some exciting suggestions. It will be a lottery. What kind of lottery? How will this lottery work? Lauren?
Rigged?
Oh, sorry.
Rigged. Okay. And Lauren?
This was kind of an area where I was a little bit confused actually, because it was unclear whether or not there would actually be a lottery for the like lower classes, or if there would be no lottery at all and things were all chosen regardless of whether
Just
or
the
not.
guardians. This is just the guardians. This is just the guardians. But essentially it would be rigged. And he tells us at 460A, there'll have to be some sophisticated lotteries introduced so that at each marriage, the inferior people we mentioned will blame luck rather than the rulers when they aren't chosen. And among other prize rewards, the young men who are in war or other things must be given permission to have sex with women more often, blah, blah, blah. So I want you all to understand what he's proposing here. Okay, try and visualize this. We're going to have a lottery, and certain badasses are going to win all the time, and certain guys are going to lose all the time. And they're just going to be like, they're just going to blame their luck. Like, oh, shit, I lost for the 85th time in a row. Guess I won't have sex. What do you think of that?
This is going to be weird, but how can they stop the people from having sex?
You know, that's a great question, Henry, that I don't think anybody's ever asked.
Isn't it more about like the punishment if they do rather than stopping them preemptively?
I'm sorry, say that again, Cameron?
Isn't it, he talks more about the punishment if they do have sex rather than trying to stop them from having sex preemptively?
I don't remember. Do you see that? If you see that, let me know.
There's like a whole section on how they've got to make marriage as sacred as possible, and then like anyone who has a child out of wedlock is going to be told that they've doomed this child or something like that.
Well, they can put it in different classes, right? That you can revert to the myth of the metals. Okay. Vivian, I see you there. I know you're upset. I'll get to you. I promise. I'm building up to it. Okay. I have to deal with a couple other things. Okay. So we're going to have this lottery, supposedly, where some people are just going to be like out of luck. Then what will happen to the children after they are born?
They would be like taken away and then like returned back to the like women so that nobody knows like which kid is their own.
They will be, you nailed it. What does he call this? Anybody notice what he called it? Where the kids are going to go to be suckled? 461B. Yeah, that's not exactly it, actually. 460, Cameron. The rearing pen. Thank you, Lauren. That is 460C. Kids are going to be put in a rearing pen. Let me tell you the last time I saw a rearing pen. I was at the state fair, and if you go to state fair in Maryland, they have pigs with like a whole litter of piglets, and they're in a pen, like a crate. And that's a rearing pen, y'all. The guardians are going to be put in a rearing pen. And as Lydia points out, they will not be suckled by their mother necessarily or at all, preferably not at all. They'll be suckled by any other woman who is lactating at the time. Now, in the spirit of in the spirit of eugenics, what's going to happen to the deficient babies? We know the answer to this already. What's going to happen? No? What did they do in Sparta? They killed them, exactly. They will not be abandoned, actually. That's where the Spartans were different from everybody else. In ancient Greece, they would leave them to be exposed on a hillside in a basket, and they might be found by someone else or not. But the Spartans were different. They had a cliff. They would just drop the babies, and the archaeologists, if they know where this cliff is, they found it. Nursing the babies, he tells us, at 460D, he says they will take every precaution to ensure that no mother knows her own child. Okay. And this is, and look at the excellent, right. So let me see here. Okay. But then, okay. So we're not going to have families. You're going to have mothers and children and fathers. And preferably the identity of all this will not be known. Big question, how do you avoid incest? What's their brilliant plan? Timing.
Okay, wait, I was confused about this because on 461E, didn't he say explicitly that brothers and sisters can have sex?
He did.
I don't understand the point of all this discussion if it's like, oh, yeah, we're going to do all this complicated thing, but you can fuck your brother. That's cool. Like, I don't.
Well, I'll go back to something that, it's not, Freud was very perceptive. He noted that, early peoples, they didn't understand biology. So they didn't actually know the biological problems of incest that we know today. As Freud, he writes about this in Totem and Taboo. Early peoples had totally different reasonings for incest. So their reasoning for incest clearly is not necessarily biological because of what Cameron pointed out. You can have sex with a brother and a sister, but not your parents. Audra.
I was just going to say that I know later, or maybe it is right now, and that's what we're looking at. But he talks about how like he is completely dissolving the family, and everybody will consider everyone of their age group to be brothers and sisters, and everyone who's who was born like I don't know. It's kind of confusing the way that he sets up the timeline, but everybody who is born 9 months after that one, they had sex would be the daughters or sons or whatever, and same thing with the grandchildren. And then, so I guess you're kind of getting like these groups, these generational groups, and then those are allowed to kind of breed together, even though they are considered brother and sister. Nobody really knows who's related to who or like what's going on, but that's what I had thought that he meant when he said brothers and sisters would be,
Oh my God, you're totally right, Audra. Cameron, do you understand? I'm not sure he's referring to biological brothers and sisters. It's brothers and sisters in the spirit of the system.
That does make sense, yes.
Yeah. This is 461E. This is where they go into description of the timeline. I'm not going to read it over. You guys can pay attention there. Lauren? Good
point. The only issue is like, it's kind of one of the things that I was trying to figure out when doing my response is that, yeah, everybody refers to everybody in the same age group as brother and sister, but there's never any guarantee that the sisters and brothers who are having like sanctioned sex with each other aren't related. It's never quite clarified.
Yeah. Good. Does anybody have any questions about the lottery while we're at it? Two. You can ask questions about any of this stuff. Audrey, is your hand up again?
No, I just forgot to put it down.
No worries. Anybody have any other questions about how this is all going to work? Lottery, rearing pen, or marriage? Marriage. By marriage, we mean sanctioned sex. All right. I'm going to return to this question. Let's deal with this one first. Why? Why? Why are we doing this? Why women and children in common? What's the fucking point? Lauren?
So that any sort of dividing family ties are dissolved. So that any loyalty that you have to your family, you have to the rest of the city. And any respect you have for your parents, you have for everyone who's above you. And you don't have any divisions.
And this is the Guardians, okay? These are the warriors. Why is this important for the warriors? Think about it. They got to march into battle. Why is this important that they have women and children in common, or that they view themselves as one big family? Kieran?
Because then they would prioritize the whole citizens and not just their family, and try to like sneak their family out in emergencies or yeah.
I love it. You're totally right. Families are a burden to a soldier because you might be less inclined to sacrifice yourself. And you know, I could put it this way. What is going to ensure that this is a fearsome fighting force? Well, if they march into battle and they see you killing their uncle or their brother or their third brother or their fourth brother or their sister and your ex-wife and blah, right? If everyone is related, what kind of fighting force is this going to be? They're going to be a terror on the battlefield, and they won't leave anybody behind, right? And they will think only of collective concerns, like Kieran points out, and not make exceptions for their own family. This is line 462C. Then is the best governed city the one in which most people say mine and not mine about the same things in the same way? It is indeed. What about the city that is most like a single person? For example, when one of us hurts his finger, the entire organism that binds body and soul together into a single system under the ruling part within it is aware of this, and the whole feels the pain together with the part that suffers. Do not forget, everybody, that this is a utopian project. And the best city, in a way, the ideal city, in a way, is the one where people are bound together. They see themselves as a family. And they're not divided by particularities, either individual or family. This is my way of saying that in a way, this makes perfect sense to be thinking in this way. Okay? Now, I am no expert on utopian literature. I saw someone here mentioned, what is that, teenage Hunger Games. Like there's a whole thing about utopian literature. There are many great utopian works throughout the past few centuries. And I'm not expert in them all, but I will just say a lot of utopian literature, a lot of utopian projects, they invariably end up talking about sex. They weigh in there. Like there has to be some kind of control of this stuff for a variety of the reasons we've discussed. Now, you understand his reasoning. That's his reasoning. What do you think about these methods? And I'm going to be very blunt. Is this doable? Why is it not doable? Where are the weak points?
I mean, yeah, free will. Like, how do you expect to keep people in herds and basically keep them as prisoners by like lying to them their whole lives? Like, somebody's gonna figure it out eventually, or someone's gonna be like, hey, I wanna like fuck. Like, what are the, I don't know. Like, just denying people, honestly, it seems like he's denying people kind of basic human rights a lot of the time. So like obviously they're not gonna want to play along. And that was like my whole time reading this, I'm like, how, like, does this dude think this is gonna actually work? Because if he thinks it's gonna actually get people to play along with this, he's freaking insane.
I'm quoting you. Does this dude think this is actually going to work? I like that quote. Well, I'm gonna ask the question again. Is that lottery really going to work? Like, what else do you have to take into account for this lottery?
I have a question about the lottery, actually.
I'm glad you do.
When he is saying that, they're pulling from the lottery and they're finding a couple and then they're marrying them together so that they can have intercourse and then create children or whatever. When he says marriage specifically, does he mean like this is now a permanent pair?
No. I think this means they're having their sex has been sanctioned. They're coupling.
Okay, so like for every raffle, everybody gets to be switched up with a different partner. Okay.
But only the good ones.
Well, yes.
And the others have to be deceived into thinking that they're just missing out. They get the wrong lottery numbers every single time.
Yeah.
Anna says it won't work. Those guardians will catch feelings for people not, I don't know what that means, catch feelings. Isn't there a song? Anyway, for people not in their lottery, and then boom, rebellion. Yeah. Just imagine that you're a super horny guardian and you get skipped over all the fucking time. Like the 85th time, you'd be like, what the fuck? Are you really going to be like what Socrates says, like, I'll just, my damn luck. Oh, my damn luck. I had bad luck. Let me break it down for you all, people. This is line 460B. This is bullshit. That's what this is. Do you smell it? This is bullshit. This lottery deserves a lot more explaining. And its premise is bullshit. Because people are not going to put up with this. They will not. And the section on 461E, where he talks about spacing out the different generations, that too is bullshit. Smell it. That deserves a handbook in itself. Is this going to work? Fuck no. Of course it's not going to work. Then what's the point? What's the point? Why is he telling us this? Lydia asks, is he crazy enough to think it will work? I don't know. You've gotten to know him a little bit in the last few weeks. What do you think? How does he describe the Guardians? What word does he use to describe these guys? They live in rearing pens. They're a herd. They're animalistic. Is that really what he's going for? Well, so listen. This is the single most important debate surrounding Plato in scholarship. Is he serious? Is Plato serious? I don't believe you can think he is, frankly. He has simply not given enough explanation, right? There's not enough context for him to suggest that he really believes what he's saying, right? Or Robert says he doesn't understand human nature. Or, I told you this from the beginning. There is a way of reading the Republic as a critique of the utopian project itself. And what that means is that utopian projects do not understand human nature. By the very premise of a utopian idea misses something about human nature immediately. If you can read, I see your hand, Audrey, let me just make this one point. You can read the Republic as saying something like, if you are interested in a utopian project, and who isn't? These are the kind of mental acrobatics and injustices you're going to have to perform to get there. Always. Audra.
I was wondering if it would maybe be possible to see this as Socrates not even really believing in his own sort of system that he set up, specifically because I don't know how to phrase this. Like, obviously, justice is a very difficult ideal to obtain. And I think he kind of realizes that, and that's kind of why he has to set up so many different like stipulations about this city so that their people can become just. And I'm wondering if maybe he internally is kind of like, yes, this is impossible because nobody will ever be able to achieve this amount of justice. Like this is all of what it would take in order to create a truly just city. Although on the other hand, his city isn't just at all, I would argue. It's not got any sort of opportunity or like freedom for like making your own decisions or anything at all. It's kind of taking control away from every single individual who lives within the city, even the rulers. And it's just sort of like, I would argue that isn't justice at all, to treat people like animals.
Good. Couple things, and then let me just respond to what Audra says, and I see Lauren has her hand up, and then I will have like a last comment because I know we're winding down here. So just FYI. Good point, Audra. Yes, I think the fact that he says in order to see justice, we have to see utopian city. That's problematic already. That kind of suggests in an inverse fashion what you just said. Like if you got to see a utopia to understand justice, then yeah, that means justice is going to be hard to come by. Absolutely. And I think that is a claim. I think that is a claim for him. I think that's what he means to say. Like justice is rare. Justice is hard to see. Izzy is right about the other point there. You're talking about a form of justice that was alien to the ancient Greeks, which is premised on individual rights and freedom. They're not completely incompatible. There are some compatibility, but that is a different type of justice. Just keep that in mind. Lauren.
Kind of building on what Audra was saying, at least personally, like as you read through, I feel like there is some credit to saying that maybe the whole idea of the city being realistic just isn't even part of this. Like it's not something that was set out to do, because like obviously Plato has plotted out the entire republic, but at least the way he frames it is not let's go create the perfect city. It's how do we figure out what justice is? And there are times where it doesn't even feel like Socrates believes what he's saying is true. Like he does a lot of, like whenever he announces a falsehood, he kind of does it sheepishly. He tells Glaucon, oh, well, this is a little bit shameful, but this is what we're going to have to tell them. And Glaucon kind of, he repeatedly says, oh yes, this is a pretty risky thing to tell people.
Good.
It doesn't always, like there are times where it feels like they really are trying to figure it out as like a genuine city, but there are also a lot of times where it feels like this is just a glorified thought experiment.
Good, which is then the occasion to think about all kinds of other things, like the nature of art, the nature of music, the nature of poetry, education, right? Lauren's point, I think, is very good. The Utopian Project, as of today, like this is going to recede into the background. The Utopian Project by book 5 is finished. We're done. They spend the next 5 books discussing other ideas that come up that are inspired by this discussion. So the Utopian Project is an opportunity to raise these other philosophical issues. I would argue it is an opportunity to kind of problematize and criticize the notion of utopian thinking as such. Now, the reason Hitler never cites Plato is because there is a divide in scholarship about whether Plato is serious. There are some scholars who believe that he was a utopian. I'm not one of them. I don't believe he was a utopian. I think that Plato was critical of this. And one of the main reasons he was critical of this is because almost everything he prescribes in book 5 was inspired by Sparta. And why the hell would he look to Sparta as a model? We need to go back to our history we discussed in the first week here. Sparta was the mortal enemy of Athens. They had conquered Athens and they had oppressed them. They had disbanded the democratic government and set up a group of oligarchs to run the city. You can read book 5 as a backhanded critique of Sparta. And let me explain to you just exactly where the overlap is. And I know we're running out of time here, but I just want to go over a couple things that the Spartans did that sound eerily familiar to what he's talking about. Okay? You have eugenics, first of all, which we've talked about. The Spartans, they had a council. The baby was born. It would be for the council. They would give a thumbs up or thumbs down, and they would dispose of the baby. They were the only ones in ancient Greece who did this. No one else did this. Everybody else would leave the baby to be exposed. You know, it was a common practice. If you had a child that you felt was disabled or you didn't want it for any reason, they would leave it on to be exposed in a basket on a hill, and often a shepherd would find it. That's the story of Oedipus. At the age of 7, children were taken away from their mothers in Sparta, and they were sent into the wild. And they would live in groups of children. They were sent out into the mountains, and they had to fend for themselves. They were not given adequate clothing, and they were expected to steal, and to supplement their food. And if they were caught, they were beaten. At the age of 12, they return to Spartan society, and they would be welcomed if they would survive an ordeal which was like this. In the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, I believe that was a goddess of the Spartans' favorite goddess. In this temple, there would be an altar with succulent, delicious foods. And the 12-year-olds would have to try and get to that food, but it was defended by a gauntlet of 19-year-olds with whips. And many of those children would die on the way. You had to succeed, get to the altar, steal the food. Okay. By the age of 12, then they are, if they survive so far, they're welcomed into the city, and they spend the rest of their lives training to be soldiers. And at the age of 20, they join common messes, which means like a mess hall for the army is like a common living arrangement. They lived in common. The only difference here is that the women did not live with women. Women, it turns out, for the ancient Spartans, they actually owned property, whereas the male soldiers did not. But interestingly enough, Aristotle kind of like looked down on the Spartans. He said that they turned their children into animals, and other Greek writers liken them, they pictured them as bees swarming around a hive, stripped of their individuality. So what's the point? Clearly, there is a very, very strong analogy here, a very strong inspiration from the Spartans, but there is zero chance that, or very little chance, I won't say zero, there's very little chance that he would have looked over the Spartans and said, good idea. Are they creating humans? Right? You got to ask yourself that. Are they creating human beings? Or are they degrading human beings? So I'll open with this discussion again next week because we're winding down here, but I have to set us up for next week's discussion, okay? And point out we've dealt with two waves of paragraphs now. The two waves of paragraph, the first wave is women will be equal to men. There will be women guardians. Second wave, women and children in common. The third wave of paradox is that philosophers will be kings. The ruling class will be philosophers. And we have a prime example of a philosopher so far, everybody. That would be Socrates. He would be king. And you got to ask yourself, really? 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 Seriously? I mean, what the hell? And the funniest part here, or maybe not the funniest, but an indicative part here is how that proposal is received, which is 474a. Socrates proposes this, and all the guys say, oh my God, if you tell people this, they're going to kill you. They will kill you if you say that philosophers should be kings. They don't say people will laugh at you. They say you will have a violent uprising, which again is in tune with how they dealt with Socrates at the end of his life. They killed him. Philosophers die. Philosophers get killed. So you want them to be the kings? That won't do well. Which leads then to the discussion, what is a philosopher? What defines a philosopher? And this is our discussion for book 7 and into book 9, okay? All right. So we are out of time. I'm going to let you all go, but if anybody wants to linger, there's my question. If anybody wants to linger and ask me any questions, I'm happy to chat for a few minutes, okay? So sorry we went later than usual today. This was a really tasty discussion, though, heated, controversial, and I'm happy to take it up again next week, okay? So have a great week, everybody. Bye.
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 Furman, I did have a question.
Do it.
So when we were discussing like the Spartans, how like the 12-year-olds have to steal the food from the 19, that whole part. Are the 19-year-olds punished if they fail? Like if
Oh,
the
I don't know.
12-year-olds?
Probably. Good question. That sounds like the Spartans to me. But
Yeah.
they were given free reign to kill the 12-year-olds if they could.
Huh. But if like the 12-year-olds succeeded and were able to steal the food, were the 19-year-olds consequently killed, do you think?
I mean, probably not. You need to have some soldiers. You need to keep soldiers. That's for a history. Read an in-depth history of Sparta and see what you find.
Okay. I was just curious if you had any ideas on that.
No, I don't. Sorry.
No worries.
Anything else?
No, I really liked today's discussion. So
Cool.
yeah.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you.
I'll see you next week.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Otto, do you have a question? Hello?